Okay, welcome and good morning.
Or good afternoon, or good evening if you're
Or good evening. Yes, we're spanning several time zones today. We're so happy that all of you are joining us, and we're so happy to be here this morning, this evening, this afternoon.
At this time.
At this time. We should just say Sherko Bekas is good hope, good bread.
Definitely.
We'll wait just a couple minutes so that people can join in. Okay, Christine.
Okay, so
we should get started.
Yeah, I think so. First of all, Becher Harten, Becher Bain, hello everybody. A big warm welcome from me and from my colleagues here. My name's Christine Robbins and I'm speaking to you from the University of Exeter. Well, strictly speaking, I'm speaking to you from my kitchen, but I'm representing the Centre for Kurdish Studies at the University of Exeter.
And my name is Marie Labrosse, and I am representing Kashkul at the American University of Iraq, Slimani, though of course I'm in my home library.
We're really very excited to be hosting these conversations on the theme of curating Kurdishness, art, culture and the archive in Kurdistan and beyond. It's quite a long title, but it's because it's a really broad theme and we're trying to capture the huge range of creativity, of making new expressions of knowledge and preserving older, treasured knowledge. that we see amongst people living in Kurdistan and coming from the Kurdistan region. I don't mean just the region in Iran, but in Iraq, but Kurdistan more generally. So we're going to be talking about poetry, art, sculpture, and also about how people curate and preserve their own precious cultural knowledge. And therefore, our guests are going to include quite a lot of young creatives and older scholars and artists from different communities, including some who may write in Kurdish, but who may not define themselves as Kurdish at all, or people who may use other languages too. Before we start, I'm going to just say a word about the Centre for Kurdish Studies in Exeter, which I think is unique in the English-speaking world. It's part of the Institute of Arab and Islamic Studies at the University of Exeter, and that institute is the UK's largest single multidisciplinary department focusing on the Middle East. So the Centre for Kurdish Studies was founded in 2006. And since then, through our MA and PhD programs, we've seen the emergence of some young scholars who've really been changing the paradigms in Kurdish studies, not least Professor Marie Labrosse, but also Dr. Farangis Ghaderi, Dr. Alan Hassanian, and many others. Our PhDs have kept coming to us over the years, but for external economic reasons, we very sadly discontinued our MA in Kurdish studies in about 2014. But that's until now, because we're delighted to announce that as from 2021, this year, we'll be offering a brand new MA in Kurdish studies. So as well as a core course in Kurdish history and politics, which will offer you the chance to engage with a huge range of sources, the students will be able to develop their own research interests, and that'll be done through guided and independent readings, presentations, creative project work, all sorts of creative project work, and of course they'll also do a developed dissertation. And we're going to be offering a number of scholarships as well, so keep an eye on our website at Exeter and we'll have all the details there. Now, in the Centre for Kurdish Studies, that's my colleagues, Dr. Clemence Scalber-Yücel and Dr. Farangis Ghaderi, we've all been involved for a long time in research on the on the preservation of knowledge and culture. So we've been working on oral history, endangered cultures, lost literature, and working on translating Kurdish text for a non-Kurdish speaking public. And most recently, we've been working on archives and how you decolonize archival processes. So the idea for this series of conversations came to us from our celebrating Kurdish culture and the possibilities for young people to follow their interests, their talents and their passions all the way through into graduate studies and into lifetime careers.
And this is exactly the kind of work that Kashkul was formed to do. Kashkul exists to support emerging and established artists, translators, and researchers. Over the last 5 years, since our founding as a Center for Arts and Culture at the American University of Iraq Slimani, we have translated over 1,000 pages of Kurdish poetry into English, placing these translations in respected literary outlets such as Modern Poetry and Translation, World Literature Today, Words Without Borders, Poetry Daily, Harriet at the Poetry Foundation, and the Los Angeles Review of Books, among others. Our small but dynamic staff of 5 works together as a collaborative, supporting each other's research, writing, and translation. And each semester in non-COVID times, we welcome artists and researchers and residents from around the world, as well as interns. So anyone watching, please feel free to apply for any of those positions. We definitely want to hear from you and be supporting our community as actively as possible. Our current research projects include the collecting, editing, and selected translations of Peter Maird's prose in collaboration with Gene Archive, and Mosul Lives, the second largest database of oral history in the Middle East. We're very much looking forward to collaborating with Christine, Zaidan, and Ahmad Bashar, another incredible poet and archivist, to expand our oral history endeavors into Shingal this upcoming year. Our partnerships include the Digital Libraries program at the University of California, Los Angeles, the University of Exeter, Royal Holloway, University London, Southampton University, Oxford, and here in Slimani, Gene Archive. Please feel free to reach out to our Assistant Director, Sarwar Taha, who's on this conversation today with any inquiries. We would love to hear from you. And we're really, truly thrilled to host today's conversation with Zaidan and David, two poet translators who have unique insight into minority languages and literatures.
Okay, so let me tell you a little bit about Zaidan. Zaidan Khalaf was born in the village of Izer on Shingal mountain, that is in English also called Sinjar, in northern Iraq in 1995. He was displaced from his home by the Islamic State's attempt to exterminate the Yazidis, and he arrived with his family in the Charmishko IDP camp in late 2014. He studied translation at the University of Duhok, and his current projects include translating Whitman's Song of Myself into Kurmanji, and also a selection of poets from Rojava into English. His poems have appeared in World Literature Today and also on the Poetry Foundation website. David Shook is a Los Angeles-based poet, translator, and editor. Their debut collection, Our Obsidian Tongues, was longlisted for the 2013 International Dylan Thomas Prize, and poems from that book have been translated into Arabic, French, Ismath Zapotec, Kurmanji, Japanese, Mandarin, Sorani, Spanish, Swedish, and Uyghur. And that book was adapted into a short film in Rwanda and published in Chile as Lenguas de Obsidiana in late 2019.
David served as Kashkul's 2019 Artist in Residence, and while there collaborated with Zaidan, then a new member of the Kashkul staff, to translate and transform his poem Barcode Scanner into a video poem. This translation, which was read on the floor of the UK Parliament, won the Zebra Poetry Film Festival 2020 Prize for Tolerance. The jury, explaining their selection, wrote, "The attribution of poetry having a voice, having a space and resistance against oppression, inhumanity, and despair, often ends up to be a banal platitude, easily spoken out by those happening to live in safer areas of the world. It becomes even more empty and flat when it's spoken out to enhance the value of poetry itself, as if literature or art in general would be the real thing to defend and save. What if a voice doesn't intentionally intend to be resistant, political, revealing? What if that voice only speaks about what's right in front of the eye, and what's right in front of the eye stays the same, day in, day out, muddy street, then tent block, muddy street, then tent block, then muddy street, and just doesn't change because the world has some valuable reason to keep things right where they are, sorted and shelved like products in a supermarket. Then the poetic voice and cinematographical eye become mediums against oppression and despair by simply and clearly scanning what's there, repeatedly and impeccably, like the barcodes of a condensed everyday life experience. Tent block, then muddy street, then tent block. We're so grateful to have these award-winning poets, translators, and filmmakers here with us today to talk about the function of poetry and literary translation when it comes to minority and often persecuted languages. So, David, would you like to start us off by talking about the role of translation and what brings you to this discipline and to Zaidan's poetry in particular?
Sure, I'd be very happy to do that. And thank you, Dr. Marie and Professor Christine, for having me today at this inaugural conversation. I'm really excited about this series, and in particular about all of the young and emerging Kurdish studies scholars who you guys have invited to participate. I think it's going to be really groundbreaking. Thanks to Zaidan, I always feel honored when I get to share the stage with him, even if we are several thousand miles apart. I came to translation of Kurdish literature through translation of literature more broadly. And before moving to Kurdistan, was not very familiar with Kurdish literature, old or new, beyond Abdullah Pasho, who I'd heard of initially through the Poetry Translation Center in London, but later through Marie's translations, which my publishing house, Phony Media, published. And then I was also familiar with Sherko Bekas and Professor Choman Hardy's translations and some of the work that Stephen Watts in the UK has done as well. And so really, I had an entirely new world to explore and discover. I had started now about, I guess, 7 years ago, a US-based nonprofit publishing house for literature and translation, specializing in translations from languages that aren't commonly translated into English. And that could be for a number of reasons. It could be because there's no commercial incentive to do so. It could be because there are very few translators, and especially literary translators. And it could be because of linguistic oppression, as in of the book of poetry from the Uyghur that I published in 2015 by Amatjan Osman, an exiled poet now in Canada. So over the course of our first 5 years of existence, we published over 30 books translated from, I think, 26 languages. Now we're up to closer to 30. And one of those books happened to be the one I mentioned, Marie's translation of Abdullah Pashot's selected poems, Dictionary of Midnight. So I had a sense of what to expect, but I knew that there was going to be a lot to discover. And as a translator, I translate primarily from Spanish and Portuguese, but I've done a lot of collaborative work, particularly with the poets themselves, to render their work into English. It's something that I've enjoyed doing, not just as a translator, but as a poet and writer myself. It's something that I find very deeply enriching to my own practice. And our process, which I'm sure Zaidan and I will talk a bit more about in this particular instance, is one that really encourages and indeed requires us to get down to the most minute decisions of how language is used, and to think about questions of how we use our own languages, whether that's Arabic, Kurmanji, or English, and to really ask ourselves why we're making the choices we're making in everyday speech, as in the written word, the printed page. So arriving in Kurdistan, I was very eager to find poets, particularly living poets, although I was also interested in the busts I saw on the streets and the poets whose names adorned the street signs. I wanted to know who was writing today and what they were writing. And I was particularly interested at that time in the poetry of northeastern Syria, in particular, Rojava, and then in poets who might be closer to me in Suli. It was not too long before I met Zaidan. And that was through an event that Kashkul put on at the University of Iraq, Slimani, in collaboration with Mairead Smith, who's now pursuing her doctorate at Brown University, wonderful scholar and translator. And she had written Marie and asked if a group of young Yazidi poets might come and give a reading. And Marie, basically, at that point, I was the artist in residence at Kashkul, and she asked me, "Can you organize this?" And I said yes. And part of that was working on the translations. Mairead had done a wonderful job on a great number of them. So some of them it was editing. Some we did do a few new translations, and we hosted this event now what must have been a little over 2 years ago. Is that right, Zaidan? Zaidan looked much younger then. He didn't have, quite as dramatic a beard. I can tell working with me has aged him considerably, which is par for the course, I think. But I was immediately attracted to Zaidan's poetry when I first encountered it, and then again at that reading that we gave at the university there. And I think a big part of that for me was how obvious it was that he was engaged with international literature. I think I'll be interested to hear Zaidan talk about his influences because, you know, as a poet who has primarily written or at least published in Arabic to date, I think you can trace a lot of Arabic language, Iraqi poets' influence on his work. I think of Sargon Bulus in particular. But I also think you can trace, you know, the work of performance artist Marina Abramovich, for example. He has poems that mention with equal ease Sasha Gray and Anne Sexton. There was just a real contemporary vitality about these poems that suggested an omnivorous reader, which is the kind of reader I aspire to be and the kind of writer whose work I most admire, the work that really engages as widely as possible and really processes and responds to the world as it is encountered. So that was the beginning of our friendship. And soon thereafter, I invited Zaidan to Suli for a short residency at Kashkul. And while he was there, we collaborated to translate a number of poets from Rojava and from Arabic as well, some poets that he knew. And really that relationship just deepened and we continued to collaborate. And I had this idea for a film based on one of his poems, which we'll read in a little bit, which has as its primary metaphor a barcode. And it suggests that the Chimishko IDP camp, where Zaidan had lived for about 5 years at that point, when seen from above, resembled a barcode. And, you know, that's a very striking visual metaphor, of course, but then it's also a very striking metaphor to use to talk about the commodification of the IDP, which is a topic that Zaidan's poetry returns to often. So we wanted to make this film, and of course, to do so, I felt like there was a key shot, which was getting a drone up above the camp. And that's what really delayed us and took the most time. We had to wait to get permission from the security services to fly our drone over the camp. We eventually did. We made the film, and that's now screened a few places around the world. It'll be screened in Athens and Mexico City soon at festivals. It won a prize in Berlin, as you mentioned, Marie. And then we've also continued to publish our translations, and we're now, I think we've published probably upwards of 20 co-translations and a wide number of publications. We have an anthology of Yazidi poetry that is now slated for publication early next year. We're finishing up the editing and translation of that volume. And we're continuing to translate Zaidan's own poetry, which has been a special pleasure. So yeah, that's a long-winded story of how we began working together.
I have so many questions I want to ask, but I'll save them. And yes, as Sedwar mentioned to everyone, please leave your questions in the chat. Christine and I obviously have questions for these two, but we hope you all do too, and we're really looking forward to fielding your questions. But for now, I'll save my questions and turn it over to Zaidan. Zaidan, what brought you to poetry in the wake of in the throes of all of the events of the last really decade, and if you'd like to talk a little bit about translation as well too, we're not ghettoizing you into poetry. We want to hear it all.
I'd like to start by thanking the three of you and everyone who is attending this panel. This is a question that I have to use my memory to answer, which is quite a challenge. I think I first turned to poetry at an early age. As a kid, I was fascinated by the Taoist ceremonies, the Qawwals, like a group of traveling saints traveling through the Yazidi village, reciting hymns accompanied by the deaf and the flute, or what are called by the Qawwals themselves, Qazu Qudum. Then I was too curious to see what was in my father's like private closet that had like love letters from girls in his university, and it also had a few books in it. All those books were in Arabic language, of course, because he studied Arabic language at the university, and it was almost impossible to get like Kurmanji books like in that time. Those books, like it was a very random collection of books, just like any like beginning readers or any beginners in reading. I remember there was like Freud's The Interpretation of Dreams, Agatha Christie's novel, the French series Rocambole, like some Sufi poetry books, including Omar Khayyam's Rubaiyat, like the Rubaiyat, and also a collection of poetry by Khalil Gibran that was put into music by Ar-Rahbani's brothers and performed by famous Lebanese singer Fairuz, which is a singer that everyone in the region is listening to in the mornings. I think all that made me like interested in poetry, but also I was also that introverted teenager and kid. I didn't like going to weddings unless I was forced to. And I was too shy to join like the dance line. I guess I missed my chance like to learn Kurmanji dances like of Dilane and Govent, but in that early age. But I built like an interest in poetry, reading and visual arts. People would also gather like in Taoist ceremonies, but because they were religious or sacred, they were more organized and everyone was more polite than ever. So people wouldn't fight over a girl like in a wedding and throw like some random stones that could break your head open like without even knowing about what was going on. But I was like, at that age, I was not devoted to writing. As much I was like devoted to drawing and sculpting. People would get impressed by that, so it was publicized. But with reading, people would ask me, why are you reading in your summer break, for example? They would think I was crazy because I read books in my summer break, and they didn't know like the difference between to read and to study, which was like also an issue. So I had to read like on the rooftop in order to get rid of such comments. With poetry, people would comment like, "Oh, are you in love? Who do you like? Who are you getting married to?" Like those questions. So it was also like poetry became a secret, because if anyone knew you were writing poetry, they would like, you are in love with girls and that. So poetry became like my secret, something I would do only like for myself, and that anyone ever read it, like those poems that I also left behind, and I don't even have access to. And I'd had my notebook in my father's closet. So if anyone found it, they think it's my father's. But soon later, I found out that that was dumb, because my handwriting was not as good as his, and my language was not as good as his. So I had to find another place to hide my notebook, since I did not like have a closet of my own. But as I just said, I left all those things behind, and when I arrived at the camp in Zaho, after days like besieged in Shingal mountain in 2014, we did not have like enough space, so I gave up sculpting and drawing, and started to write things in my like phone's notes, my phone's memo, and I sought like refuge in poetry. That then I met some wonderful poets who are now close friends, Sarmad, Jafar, Imad, and others, and we would share what we wrote together, like with each other, and we would have like nightly gatherings where we would recite those poems to each other, and we would like give each other's applause and criticism. It was like, they were fun days. So I think this is how I turned to poetry. Yeah.
Christine, I think you're muted.
Myself. Thank you, both of you, for that. And I think it would be lovely to actually hear some of the poems, and ask, so I'd like to ask both David and Zaidan to read some original poems and their translations, and then we'll have questions afterwards.
Sure. Zaidan, would you like to read the originals first, and I'll follow with the translations?
Sure. What would you like to start with?
Let's start with, what is an IDP camp?
Okay. Campa چیه؟ لجاوی دیده زحمانکه، لجاوی فروگوانی بیکنینگ بیجده کارتونه کیگه، او فروگوانی دب جتماشین خواه ین بخانیان را برناده، لجاوی مشکی خودیده پارچه بنی کیریه، لجاوی جنگی ده آخورگه و گریگ اوره لجاوی گسگی هانوها ریده.
What is an IDP camp? A cemetery in a skylark's eye. An egg carton to the eye of the prankster pilot, mocking as many houses as he can. Blocks of kiri cheese to the eye of God's mouse. A stockyard in the eye of war. And to the eye of the recently departed, it is a herd of clouds. It's one of the shortest poems in Zaidan's book, which will come out there in Kurdistan very soon under the Kashkul Books imprint. I think it's one of the most powerful too. If you'd like to, we're going to read a barcode scanner as well, but we were also thinking it would be nice to read one of our recent collaborations, one of our translations of a poem by Hoshman Kado. And this poem was actually it's a prose poem, and we just found out on Monday that it had been selected to be included in the 2020 Best Microfictions anthology. It originally appeared in the magazine Epiphany, a US-based literary journal. Would you like to read the Kurmanji first, Zaidan?
Sure. کۆلان کۆلان ئەمەدە هەیڤ لنگی خۆش بیر دکە تۆ کەس لێ ناتەرپلە تەنێ کوچک پشتی نیڤێ شەوێ وی پارچە پارچە دکن و هەر یەک جوان ژی بپارە خوا قایل نابە نەژی چاوێن وان بار دبن کوان پارچەیان لوێ دەرێ بهێلن ji ber wilo awta wan bi xişa kişandina kîsan re vedimire dengê kûçkan bêhna min deng nake belkî ew rastiya tewrî durist e aniha nemaze piştî ku gehrebe vedimire êdî nema bawerî bi kolanên bajêr tê û ne jî yawan bi kesî tê avahî jî kevzên hundirê xwe di merzîban de diherikîne jiyana lal merzîb razên hişê tîbûnê ji lewre serban avê berbiwan de diherikîne li kêlika hermalekê xewneke nizm gazinê ji bilindahiya dîwaran dike tenê pencere di rûyê çivîkan de digirnijê tenê çivîk ji bilindahiyê tê digihiştin zarokên taxê bi bêciriya xwe ya nexweş ew bilindahî li ser rûyê kolanê ra dixist zarokên bi qasî gewdeyên xwe her tişt dikir bêlîstok û ji bîr dikir ku bilîzin kolanan jî bi tazîbûna xwe dilê zaroka dilerzandin tenê kûçika di hembêza wê de pal dida zarok û kolan cêwiyê hevin û dijminin zarok û kolan cêwiyê hevin û dijminin jî di heman demê de yek ji wan têra xewnên êdîn nake tenê hêlan baweriyan diguherîne û pêlên ji bîrkirinê her tim pir dike dem jî xwemîna bûkekê di hişên zarokan de nazik û dibe şekir da كو روجن ججني وتبشكر دا روجن ججني دا روجن ججني دا زمان خوا بخوش بكن.
Beautiful. Thank you, Zaidan. I've dropped the link to the text in both the original and an English translation in the chat box for anyone who'd like to follow along. Zaidan and I have translated a number of poems by Hoshman and also by his brother, Jiwan, who's also a fantastic poet. And I in particular really like these somewhat surreal narratives that really focus on childhood and as the world as seen and understood or not from the place of childhood. This one is called Streets. On our street, the moon forgot its leg. No one trips over it. In the middle of the night, only the dogs tear into it, but none is happy with their ration, their hungry eyes insatiable. And so their barking is extinguished by the crinkling of plastic bags. Dogs barking does not annoy me. Perhaps it is the only indisputable perception, especially when the power cuts out at this time of night. No one trusts the city streets any longer, and the streets trust no one either. The buildings, too, tip their gutters to pour their algae onto mute life. The gutters are mysteries of thirst, and so the roofs drive the water into them. Outside every house, there is a diminutive dream that complains about the high walls that surround it. Only the windows smile at the sparrows, the only ones who can reach them. The neighborhood children lay the rubble they've made of the walls on the street like a rug. Children turn everything into games and then forget to play them. The streets, too, break the children's hearts with their emptiness. Only dogs lie in their arms. Children and streets are both twins and enemies at the same time, neither sufficient for the other's dreams. Only abandonment changes minds and stokes the waves of forgetting. In children's minds, time too pampers itself like a bride, becomes a candy to be enjoyed on the feast day. Translating that poem together was a lot of fun and also quite challenging. I remember in particular talking about how to translate that image of the walls
Yes.
being turned into rubble that was laying out like a rug on the street. We spent a long time discussing that. And it was, I mean, one of the very interesting things for me as I've worked increasingly with Kurdish language literature and with Kurmanji literature in collaboration with Zaidan in particular is the way we have to unravel and sometimes expand the language of the English to be able to contain the visual metaphors that are much more compact and succinct in the original. So it's one of the things that's really fun and makes the challenge, I think, worthwhile. Zaidan, shall we go back to your poetry and read the title poem of this collection and the poem that narrates our film, A Barcode Scanner?
Sure. So this poem is originally written in Arabic. قارئوا باركود قطاع خيم فشارع زفت فقطاع خيم. في البدء كان الرقم، والرقم صار سعرا والتصق بنا، وسهل الرقم انتقاءنا عن بعد دونما استعانة بالسبابة. ثم صارت الأرض مذياعا وببطارية أبدية لا يبث محطة ولا يكف عن التشويش. شارع زفت فقطاع خيم فشارع زفت. نربينا على كره الموت وحب الموتى، نربينا على حب الحياة وكره الأحياء. يغني لأحد المجنون وهو يهرب من مراهقين يحاولون نزع بيجامته عنه. قطاع خيم فشارع زفت فقطاع خيم. النازح حمار وحشي في عراء مسيج، ويتصفح منشورات مجموعة مغلقة على الفيسبوك. شارع زفت فقطاع خيم فشارع زفت. فلتبيض عيناك وتصير جثة الطاووس رقعة عين لك أيها القرصان التائه. دعاء أمهات جائعات يطبخن الملل على أبناء يشخرون في منتصف النهار في كل خيمة. قطاع خيم فشارع زفت فقطاع خيم. من يعرف النازح بشروق الشمس، من يقنعه أن للشمس أي غرض آخر غير بث الحرارة. شارع زفت فقطاع خيم فشارع زفت. الزوبعة التي تدخل الخيمة وتطيرها عن رأسك ليست سوى رقصا صوفيا للحياة الزاهدة الساخرة منك. قطاع خيم فشارع زفت فقطاع خيم. مادا يده وماسكا البطاقة التموينية، هكذا يسير النازح في الشوارع بحثا مثل مستشعري ألغام. شارع الزفت فقطاع خيم فشارع زفت. بائع الطماطم ليته مهرجان التراشق بالطماطم يقام هنا لمرة واحدة على الأقل، لينعم الشعب برؤية الأحمر بطريقة أخرى. قطاع خيم فشارع زفت فقطاع خيم. بائع البصل فلتحيا الحياة، بائع الباذنجان ها ها ها. قطاع خيم فشارع زفت فقطاع خيم. الحياة يأس مشفر في المخيم، والنازح ليس بهاكر. شارع زفت فقطاع خيم فشارع زفت. قطاع خيم فشارع زفت فقطاع خيم. شارع زفت فقطاع خيم فشارع زفت. عزيزي المستهلك، تعذر التعرف على البلد المنتج للحرب.
Thank you, Zaidan. That was beautiful. I still remember the first time I heard you read it at AUIS. A barcode scanner. Tint block, then muddy street, then tint block. In the beginning, there was the number, and the number became a price tag stuck to us. The number made our selection easier from afar. No need to point. Then the earth became a radio with an eternal battery, no broadcast station, and no stop to the disruption. Muddy street, then tint block, then muddy street. We raise ourselves on the hatred of death and the love of the dead. We raise ourselves on the love of life and the hatred of the living. The crazy nobody is singing while teenagers chase him, trying to strip off his pajamas. Tint block, then muddy street, then tint block. The IDP is a zebra in a fenced-in wilderness, browsing the statuses of a closed Facebook group. Muddy street, then tint block, then muddy street. May your eyes cloud over and the peacock's corpse become your eye patch, deviant pirate. The prayer of hungry mothers, boiling boredom for their children, who snore through midday in every tent. Tent block, then muddy street, then tent block. Who introduces the IDPs to sunrise? Who convinces them that the sun serves any purpose but heat? Muddy street, then tent block, then muddy street. The wind in your tent is just an ascetic Sufi mocking you with each whirl. Tent block, then muddy street, then tent block. With his ration card held high in his extended hand, the IDP walks along the street searching like a mine detector. Muddy street, then tent block, then muddy street. A tomato vendor. If only there were a tomato festival so that people could learn to associate the color red with something else. Tent block, muddy street, then tent block. An onion vendor. Long live life. An eggplant vendor. Ha ha ha. Tent block, then muddy street, then tent block. Life in the camp is encrypted despair, but the IDPs are not hackers. Muddy street, then tent block, then muddy street. Tent block, then muddy street, then tent block. Muddy street, then tent block, then muddy street. Dear consumer, could not identify the producer of war.
David, just like you, I still remember that the first time I heard Zaidan read that poem. And of course, my Arabic is not anywhere close to where my Surani Kurdish is. And so one of the main moments I could understand, of course, was the repetition of Shario Zift, Fakat al-Khiyaman, Shario Zift. Words I didn't know at the time, but learned. The poem taught me the words by how it used them. And then that moment—
Be careful if you're learning your entire vocabulary from Zaidan's poetry.
That's how I learned my entire Surani vocabulary. Now it's from poetry. But I also remember that moment of ha ha ha. And the first time I heard it, I thought, I wonder what that laughter is doing in that poem. And I was so grateful for your translation. Thank you both. What a wonderful reading. I wish we had time for so many more poems.
Yes, thank you. It's worth mentioning too that that translation is not just mine, and indeed not just ours. We've worked with a lot of people on these translations, including Briar Bajalan, who will be presenting next in this series, I think. And as I mentioned before, Mairead Smith too, is very essential to our introduction, but to this process as well.
Yes.
You can tell I've heard Zaidan read the poem many times because I really put some practice into doing his ha, ha, ha. It's very compelling.
Yeah. I do love that you all acknowledge your contributors. That's something that Kashkol really loves to do, is make communities of artists and then really acknowledge each member of the community to the fullest. So I think that's beautiful to hear you both do that. Thank you. We'll move into some prepared questions. I'll start with you, Zaidan. I had a question. You and I have spoken a lot about the impact of Saddam Hussein's policy of forced Arabization on your education, on your upbringing as an artist and a person. And you've mentioned that much of your formal education was in Arabic, which we saw shining through in the second original poem you read. But your mother tongue is in Kurmanji, which of course we heard come through so beautifully in the first original poem you read. And I wondered, which is a question very similar to a lovely former student of mine, Rosa Aziz. She posted a question really asking how the language you write in changes what you write. And I'll just quickly, Zaidan, put her question in your mind as well. Can a poet write the same poem in Kurdish and English with the same intentions and metaphors, for example? Or is it better to write in your native language and leave the translation for someone else? So there you have a field of questions about how the language you write in changes what you write, if at all, and then how that translation process works, especially when you know the language in which you're being translated to. So Rosa, thank you for that question.
Thank you for this question, Marie, and thanks, Rosa. For the first part of the question, I don't really know how it changed my writing on paper, but with Arabic, I feel what I write is being filtered in some ways, or it is some sort of translation in my mind. And what I write is more informed by my knowledge that I gained like through the Arabic language than, for example, my childhood memories, which is what I feel poetry like first springs from. And I remember them like in Kurmanji. It was before I learned Arabic. I lived those moments. In some ways, my memory was formed like in Kurmanji. My poems in Arabic are like or were a sort of immediate responses to something, while my Kurmanji writing is what like have been processed or fermented in my memory. My ear's memory like is informed, is formed like in Kurmanji. For example, the Taus Giran that I mentioned, my grandmother's tales and songs, the cursing words from my mother, like every time I was late for dinner because I worked on a drawing or a sculpture. All that and more. With Arabic, my contact with Arabic language was in school, in books, and through TV. The Arabic language was my window to the world literature at first, before I knew English, and before I had access to any other like Kurmanji books. And it was my window to Sufi Persian poetry, and through it I read like the Arabic Sufi poetry and the origin. But it was also my window to read about like the Muslim conquests. And every time I read about a battle where the Abbasid or the Umayyad or the Ottomans were the victors, I felt I was the defeated in each of those battles, because their atrocities, such as like taking women of the enemy as sex slaves, which were permitted as spoils of war, were presented as victors in those history like books and curriculums. While in my grandmother's stories, our women were taken or stolen and the men were killed. This like in some sense would trouble my relation to Arabic language as like the language of my longtime oppressors or persecutors. Yeah, but I love like the language. I love I love the Arabic language. I love that it gave me a lot of knowledge and a window to world literature, and an insight to the history from another point of view. Yeah. For the, I hope I answered the first part of this question. The second part, I am actually not sure if we can, if anyone can write like a poem in two languages that are completely the same, because like the structure, the metaphors of every language, everything like differs from a language to another. And often, like if you write a poem that very like that version in that language you are writing in becomes like the original version, and any other versions after that, it's a mere translation, I think. Thank you.
Thank you. Can I follow up with a question, Zaidan? It sort of follows on very much from what you've just been talking about attitudes to different languages. So you write in Arabic and Kurdish, but of course you are from a Yazidi background. Does that change your relationship to Kurdish? And if so, how?
Like to Kurdish, to Kurmanji as a language?
Yeah, maybe to Kurmanji as Kurdish, as a kind of Kurdish as well.
Mm. This is a very hard question, but let me think about it. I think Kurds too, for a long time, although like we share a language, we share a land, we share like cultural like similarities and many things, but Kurds too, like were our persecutors for a long time. And in the modern history of the Kurds and the history that is presented in schools, like for example, in literature that is presented like in, or that is taught in the schools, like in the curriculum here in Iraqi Kurdistan, let's take, we have like some sort of independence, and the language, the schools are Kurdish. So the curriculums exclude for example, the history curriculums exclude the Yazidi historical figures, while at the same time borrowing other like historical figures from the Abbasid or from the Umayyad histories that are like Arabic or Islamic history, and include them in the Kurdish history. For literature, for example, Sheikh Fakhri Adia, who was like a poet, is excluded from Kurdish literature, while Ahmad Khani is included. Pir Rashi Hayran is excluded from Kurdish literature, while Malay Jaziri is included. So I think as people with Kurds, we've always faced like we were exposed to all kinds of like exclusion, just like any other neighboring people in the region. But my relation to Kurmanji, it's that the language, it's the language of my family. It's the it's not something that was imposed on me to learn and to write in and to think in. And even though maybe in the family too, like language is a sort of like imposing thing. They are imposing it on you. But at least I know that my first memory was formed in that language, and that is like crucial to my writing. Yes, I hope I answered your question.
Thank you. I think that you did. Yes, thank you.
Thank you.
Marie, would you like to ask another question?
Yeah, I thought we could follow on from this idea. Exclusion and inclusion is such a huge question in literature, and how we form our ideas of who is a part of which literature and who is a part of the literature even that the world widely reads. These are such important questions, Zaidan. And David, I know these are questions you've interacted quite a lot with as a translator, of course, but also as an editor and publisher. And I love Phoneme's tagline that they publish curious books for curious people. And I wondered if you could talk with us, why translate from these less represented languages into English? And also, of all the languages you translate from, Spanish, Portuguese, the indigenous languages of Mexico, Kurdish, Arabic, I believe Farsi as well, what interests you about translating from Kurdish?
Well, these are also big questions. You guys are really coming at us with the heavy hitters this morning. I'll do my best. I think my personal interest stems from a curiosity, I think, about the world, and also from a dose of skepticism that any tradition represented as a monolith is really an oversimplification. And I think, you can say that in a regional sense, where, talking about the whole Middle East, we're familiar with Arabic language, Persian language, perhaps Turkish language literature, but have read very little Kurdish language literature in English. And of course, there are clear geopolitical reasons for that, I think. And then you can look at it at another level as well. Who within Kurdish literature is marginalized or pushed to the side? Those are both important questions. Really, I think I personally, I'm hesitant to make big picture abstractions or to overly romanticize what I aspire to do as an editor and publisher. But I can say personally that my life has been very deeply enriched by my engagement with literatures from around the world, and in particular by literatures that are quite unlike the traditions I was brought up in, the traditions I participate in. And I think my world has really been expanded, and my mind has been broadened by that engagement in ways that I think have real value in both the literary sense, but in a much larger social sense. I think Kurdish literature in particular interests me because it's a language that, as Zaidan was just telling this story, I've heard many Kurds tell me this, and many of the Kurds that I've collaborated with as translators. Briar is another Kurdish translator who was forcibly Arabized as a child. And I think in instances where language and culture are oppressed, where they're pressed down on, where they're banned or made illegal in many instances, as we know. I think about how many of the poets we're now translating from Rojava had their first books published in samizdat, basically facsimile editions that would circulate underground and that you could go to jail for possessing. I think that kind of pressure produces a very intimate and dynamic and changing relationship with language that excites me, because I think that language really, as the medium of literature, is something always evolving and always changing. And I think that a lot of literary innovation comes from the margins, as we're discussing them now. I think my own writing has been quite enriched by the Kurdish poetry I've encountered, whether as a reader or as a friend of the poets or a co-translator. And I think that I'm thinking of some of the more experimental Kurdish poets now, in particular, things like Bekas Now a Girl Is My Homeland, things like the early visual and erasure poems of Pirbal, things like Zaidan's poetry, frankly. I think these poets are doing interesting things, not just with the Kurdish language, but with language, period. And that's my interest. Of course, I think in a world where so little of our literature is in translation, the commonly cited statistic is 3%. And I think that's actually probably a bit high, and also not a bit overstated. But I think when so much of our literature is written and consumed entirely in English, and so much of what is written and consumed in that tiny percentage of literature that we receive in translation comes from French, Spanish, Chinese, and German, little Japanese, little Italian. Almost, if you look at the translation, there's a database for all the books published in translation in fiction and poetry for every year going back about a decade now. And in that time, I believe there have been 3 book-length single author collections of poetry translated from Kurdish. 2 of them yours, Marie. Of course, there have been some fiction published, some really great books of Kurdish fiction. There have been poems in magazines, there have been anthologies, things like that. But it's an infinitesimal amount of what's available. And I think continuing to diversify our literature, to diversify our reading, I think those are all really important steps toward building a more equitable literature, and from there, I hope, a more equitable world.
Thank you, David. Sorry.
Christine, go.
Yes, I think that we probably need to move along to questions from the floor, from those of you who are attending and listening. We have probably answered, well, we think we've referred to Rosa's question already, and Nishtaman will answer your question later, don't despair. But first of all, this is really for David and Zaidan. Briar says, does a film of poetry ruin the pleasure of assimilating the poetry and engaging with it in your own way? Does it kill the place of reflexivity? He would like to know the poet's and the filmmaker's view on this issue.
Oh, definitely, Briar. Just kills it. I think I'll answer this in regards to one particular aspect, and one thing that I think poetry can, one way that I think film can really serve poetry in translation in particular. I think subtitles are magic, basically. I think, you know, in the English speaking world, particularly here in the United States, you guys over there, Christine, are significantly more cosmopolitan, but we really tend to begrudge subtitles and think, you know, that they make things inaccessible or onerous. And I think for poetry, they're really magical because they enable us to read the semantic content of a poem while simultaneously hearing the poem in its original language. And as we know, the sound of a poem is essential to its very qualifying to be part of the category of poem as we understand it. I think, you know, we often argue about accuracy, which is, you know, I think a little boring. But also, I think, how can we talk about accuracy if we're not talking about the sound of a poem, about the orality of a tradition? And I think that combination, the subtitles, being able to read a poem while hearing the original, is something that we really haven't explored the full potential of yet. Of course, I think it's really cool to be able, especially when we're talking about poetry from such different places, to be able to depict some of the context visually as well. Although I can see how one could argue that could be a distraction rather than an enhancement. I hope, at least in our case, that's not true. How do you feel, Zaidan, having seen your own work turned into a film?
I think it's the poetry film is quite interesting because it saves you from like an explanation that readers or viewers think that you owe them, and and also, just like you mentioned, I think it presents like all the mediums together, like the visual side, like the sound, and the poem written or translated like as a subtitle, and of course this gives the viewer or the reader like more accessibility to the words of the poem. Perhaps like one time viewing a film would give you more accessibility to the words of a poem than reading it for only one time. Which is what most like readers or viewers or film viewers do. Like they are interested in reading a poem once, perhaps only once sometimes. So I think it gives it like more chances to be received or perceived by its audience or its
I love that idea of the more chances to be received. That's a lot of the way I think about translation, Zaidan, is another way for a poem to find its readers. I think that's really beautiful. Thank you both. We have so many wonderful questions coming in. Christine, do you think we have time for one or two more questions?
I think either one big one or two small ones.
Miriam and Kerem and Rosa, thank you so much for your questions. Quickly, I'll just say to Nishtiman Khalaf, the Kurmanji versions will be published of Zaidan's poetry in this book that David and Zaidan are working on now for Kashkul's series, Kashkul Books. And I think that will be available within the year, no, David? Yes. Okay, great. So then hopefully this is a small one, and then we can get to one of Miriam's questions and then maybe one of Kerem's. Miriam was wondering about, and this relates to another question we received that I didn't come with a name, about how translation works. Is it recommended for someone who knows the poet well, a family member or a friend or a partner, to translate the poetry of someone they're close with? Thinking about the role of bias in the translator, although I think translation may be purely biased, Miriam, I'm worried about that. But I'd love to hear what you both think, because both of you are translators and both of you have translated specifically people you're very close with. So I wondered about that.
Zaidan, do you want to kick that off? Do you think? I mean, I think I am biased in translating Zaidan's work, and I'm not even related to him. I mean, bias is an interesting question. Are there instances when bias is bad in a literary context? Of course, but I also don't think. I mean, I think in many instances, the best translators are also advocates for the writers they're translating. Whether that means sending that poet's work out to magazines or publishing houses to find opportunities to better get the poet's work out into the world, or whether that means trying to find space for that poet to continue doing what they're doing, as Zaidan is at Kashkul. So I don't know. I think it's a bit of a different issue, of course, when you're talking about the friendly bias between two colleagues and having your mother translate your poetry, which I can imagine brings up a few other issues. Do you have any thoughts on that, Zaidan?
If it's a bias, I also think it's a beautiful bias, but part of what makes me be encouraged to know a poet more or is because I like their poetry, and for example, I cannot give in translation, I cannot give a poem I don't like what I give to a poem I like in translation. So if our love for a poem is a bias because we know the poet in some ways, then it's a beautiful bias.
Christine, would you like to choose which one of, this is an impossible choice, which one of these audience questions to end with, but I'll leave it to you, Christine.
Yes, I think that I very much like the questions that Kerem asked, and he said it was actually a question that we were also interested in asking to Zaidan. Kerem says, "I'm thinking of your generation of Yazidi poets whose works I have read, Emad Bashar, Jaf, Saad Shivan." And he says the challenges of recovering shattered identities and writing poetry after catastrophe seem to seep into the poetic language of Yazidi poets of your generation. Do you think we can talk about a generation, a shared duty or impulse to write poetry for you and for your generation of Yazidis?
Thanks for this question, Karen. I miss you. It's a chance to say that. I think it is, or at least the very beginning of our experience is like of some sort of generational like thing or impulse in writing, as we are busy with almost like the same issues of our traumas of the past genocide, our life in IDP camps, and like similar issues and but again, like maybe every one of us has like their influences. Every one of us has different interests in like in knowledge and for example in visual arts and in history and like in everything what makes it like all this like writing possible. I'm not sure if I am the right person to state that this could be like a generation or a movement or something, but I'd like, even if it is, I'd like for every like poet to be perceived like as an individual poet, not as a part of a group, because it's what poetry about. Like it's very personal. If whether we want it or not, poetry is at the very end is very personal. But it always has like the anxieties of our generations, the problems, the issues, even. Those are things you cannot ignore while writing, because we are unconsciously influenced by everything that happens before our eyes or in our lives, or yeah.
Thank you for that. I think with that we'll have to wind up, because we were quite flexible about time, but we have gone a little longer than we thought we would. So I'd like to say a big thank you to David and to Zaidan. And as Amir Sharifi has said, this was a tremendous awakening of senses. And I think for me, it really has been. It was so wonderful to hear you both read this poetry and talk about it. What we've done today is the recording. This is being recorded on YouTube channels, and so that we hope people will have the chance to listen to it, and they'll be able to listen to it on the AUIS channel and on the Institute channel in Exeter very soon. And I'll leave it to Marie to talk about the next presentation.
Yes, and I'll just add my gratitude, especially to all of those who attended and asked excellent questions. I'm so sorry we didn't have enough time to get to all of them. Please keep coming back and bringing these amazing questions, this amazing critical awareness to these sessions. It was really a pleasure to receive your questions. I'm sorry we couldn't take more. Next week, we will talk with Briar Bajalan, an AUIS alumni and former Kashkuler, whose dissertation from his MA in Middle Eastern Studies at the University of Exeter just won the Glencairn Balfour Paul Award for Best MA Dissertation. We're really excited to talk with Briar because, as David said, he's also been actively transforming in his scholarly and creative careers, actively transforming his upheaval, dislocation, and forced Arabization into beautiful strengths, and as I said, in both his scholarly work and creative. So we're so excited to see Briar next week and talk with him. And again, so grateful to Zaidan and David for helping us kick off this wonderful series.
Thank you, and thank you, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, guys. May all your biases be beautiful.
Thank you. We'll do our best.
Thank you.
Thank you all.